it's going to turn out that usually about 2 to maybe at the most 5% of genes are notably sensitive to our social environmental conditions. The vast majority of genes in, let's say, a white blood cell or the brain or a liver or something like that are busy being brain cells and liver cells. They're going to keep doing what they're doing regardless of what our social or psychological circumstances are. But a highly influential, relatively small subset of those genes are notably sensitive to the social environment, and they, it looks like, play a major role in structuring the social gradients in disease that we're often most concerned with. So one question we've tackled is which types of genes are sensitive to social circumstances, the exceptions to the general rule that they're just going to go on keeping neurons, and liver cells. Which particular signal transduction cascades, what connects social conditions to the regulation of those particular gene blocks, ranging all the way from the brain processes involved through particular neuroendocrine response systems, transcription factors, that sort of thing. Can we follow the flow of information from the outside social context through essentially our sensoria, our interpretive perceptual systems into the neuroendocrine system? So here's a couple examples of that kind of thing. So this pathway here through the sympathetic nervous system, it turns out, is probably the dominant driver of that syndrome I talked about earlier, this upregulation of inflammatory genes and this sort of teeter-totter downregulation of type 1 interferons and certain types of antibody genes. That happens when our brains essentially interpret the world as threatening or uncertain, but not profoundly overwhelming and defeating. So this is kind of everyday challenge, leads to low-grade but significant activation of sympathetic nerve fibers, sometimes release of epinephrine from the adrenal gland. In both cases, beta adrenergic receptors present on the surface of white blood cells are capable of essentially hearing that neuroendocrine signal, and they are hooked up through second messenger systems to transcription factors that essentially execute a couple of distinct programs on the DNA present in the white blood cells. They, for example, very effectively stimulate the transcription of inflammatory genes, particularly pro-inflammatory cytokines, interleukin-1 beta, interleukin-6, things like that. And at the same time, they actively repress the transcription of genes that encode these type 1 interferons, like interferon alpha family or interferon beta. So that kind of response is particularly characteristic of what we see in what you might call free-range human beings confronting what you might call the normal, relatively common slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, kind of difficult circumstances in everyday life, poverty, post-traumatic stress disorder, wide variety of the other risk factors that I talked about that seem to share in common this sort of elevated inflammatory signaling. If instead of feeling challenged and threatened, I instead interpret the world as just completely beyond any possible hope of control, I'm just profoundly overwhelmed, what would happen instead is the brain activates something that biologists often call a defeat withdrawal response. There's much less prominent activation of these sympathetic nerve fibers, and instead you see much more activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, much more cortisol released from your adrenal gland, and that signals through a completely distinct receptor system that is essentially wired onto the genome in a very different way. It does robustly suppress the activity of these interferon genes, but it also quite robustly suppresses the activity of the inflammatory genes. So this distinction in how, for example, inflammatory genes are regulated essentially tells us that different ways of experiencing possibly the same objective life circumstances will call forth different transcriptional responses at the level of DNA. In other words, this is all being filtered through our potentially different experiences of, at least in principle, potentially similar life circumstances, depending on whether we think of them as challenges versus overwhelming, defeating things that we just need to kind of hunker down and hope to survive.